Hey everybody, and welcome to the Double Stuff Podcast, where we're double the hosts, double the topics, and double the fun. I'm Dan.
I'm Alan.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Charity.
And today we are thinking deep thoughts about the universe and our place in it. But as you may know from listening to our show, none of us are what you would call philosophers. So we decided to bring in an expert today. I'd like to introduce everybody.
We're not smart.
You're just going to start us off saying we're all dumb.
No, I'm trying to hype, I'm like the hype man here. No, I want to introduce my brother-in-law and a doctor of philosophy, Dr. Rob Byer. Hey, Rob, how's it going?
Good. Hello, everybody.
Thank you for being on the show today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So as I mentioned, you do have a Ph.D. in philosophy, and I just kind of wanted you to maybe just give us a little intro into your qualifications, as it were.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. So I have a bachelor's degree in literature and a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Fort Hays State University here in Kansas, in Hays, Kansas, the northwest part of Kansas. I got my master's degree and my PhD in philosophy from the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. And I've been teaching at Fort Hays for about 7 years, since about 2014. And I teach a variety of courses. So my dissertation and the stuff that I studied primarily in graduate school was in what's called metaphysics and religion. So my dissertation was on the ontological argument for God's existence and looking at it since the 11th century when Anselm of Canterbury developed it, all the way through 20th century, 21st century people that used developments in modal logic to recast the argument. So I teach philosophy of religion. I teach world religions. I took a lot of classes on Confucianism and Chinese philosophy in graduate school, as well as philosophy of biology and philosophy of science. But we teach a lot of stuff. If you're at a small college, you got to teach everything. So I teach bioethics, business ethics, logic, critical thinking, introduction to philosophy. You name it, I probably teach it. I don't teach like philosophy of law. I don't know political philosophy, but do a lot of stuff.
There's a lot.
Sounds like you're running the whole school.
Yeah.
Is there anything you don't teach?
Yeah, right? Like he's doing all of it, it sounds like.
He basically did the whole podcast. Thank you for joining us, everybody.
Now, one of the things that we are doing this season on the show is we're kind of talking about scholastic topics, especially with the start of the school year. And I was kind of just wondering, what got you interested in philosophy? Like, was it in school? Was it like outside of school? How did you get started with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've always naturally been inquisitive, and to go back to something, Dan, that you said that that nobody here's a philosopher. I actually think it's a little different. I actually think everybody does philosophy. They just don't think about it in that way. They don't use those terms. But I mean, if you have beliefs about what's right and wrong, and you have beliefs about what's real and what's not real, if you have beliefs about like what counts as knowledge versus just opinion or assertion or belief, you're doing philosophy. Just because you don't have like a specialized vocabulary or you read what a bunch of dead white dudes said doesn't mean that you're not doing it, right? It's just like it's doing it in a different way, I think, or in a natural, intuitive way that all of us do it. So in terms of what got me interested, like I said, I've always been a very inquisitive person, which of course was irritating to my father growing up because you couldn't just give a reason. It's like, no, why? No, why can't I go visit my friends or whatever, right? Or why is the sky blue or whatever it is, right? And so that's sort of part of it. I also took some classes in high school that were really formatively important. So I took a government class. I went to school in Larned where Dan went. And so we had Mr. Byer was our government teacher. And he introduced like political philosophers that I thought were really interesting, like, John Locke or Thomas Hobbes or other people. And then I also took a psychology class, in Larned, that was taught by Mr. Snyder. And the thing that I think really in that class that drove me to what was interesting is we would get on these very broad, interesting conversations, right? We'd be talking about like the nature of the mind or how people think or how emotions and rationality are related. And we get into these really broad kind of topics. And then what would happen every time is if we got too far afield, the teacher would say, okay, we got to come back. That's philosophy. That's not psychology. But I was like, well, that's what I want to do, though. Like, that's the stuff I want to talk about, right? Like, that's what I'm interested in. So I decided to go into philosophy when I was still in high school, which is really uncommon. It's very rare for someone to do that, mostly because you don't have any exposure to philosophy in high school. For the most part, if you went to like a private school or like a religious school, sometimes you did have a philosophy class, but it's not something taught like English and social studies, like, at lots of, state schools or whatever. So, so I kind of knew that I wanted to do it initially. Just, I don't know. I think I always wanted to be, I wanted to be something I thought you couldn't be, which is like I wanted to be a sage. And that's not a real thing anymore, right? You can't just be a sage anymore. And so I thought, I don't know, this is the closest thing to it. So.
Yeah, and you went. I mean, you never deviated. Like you just went right for it, and now you're doing that. Now you are a sage.
That's right. Yeah. So I studied philosophy, and I think for a while. So I got a degree in English too, as I noted. But the other thing that I think that I did do initially is I started to get a degree in education as well. But that was too much stuff. Like there was just too many things to do. So I dropped out off of that and just kept the philosophy and literature. And yeah, then I went to grad school and was lucky enough to get a job out of grad school and still doing it. So very, very lucky, very grateful.
So my question to you, Rob, listening to all of your accomplishments that you did in school, how long were you in school to get all of your degrees? Because I feel like you were there for like 10 years or something.
Yeah, that's basically right. I mean,
my gosh.
I mean, it was close to that. So it took me 5 years for my undergraduate to get 2 bachelor degrees. So it's just 1 extra year to get those extra classes. And then I was in grad school for my master's and my PhD from 2007 to 2014. So it was about 12 years of schooling.
Oh my goodness.
That's
I was doing good to get my 4, I gotta say.
Yeah, it's not for everybody, for sure. It's a lot of time, and it's a significant investment. You don't know that you're going to get a job when you come out, and you also have kind of lost, there's like a time cost associated, right? So if I had started working right when I got out of my undergraduate, I would have, maybe got some promotions and raises. And I basically started at, what for academia was an entry-level position in 2014. So just there's a lot of potential, money, I guess, lost. But, nobody goes into teaching philosophy for the money. So
I would hope not.
Yeah.
Thank you for that encouragement, Alan.
Yeah, that's right. Nobody does. So
Actually, I do have a question because this was something that I dealt with in school when I was trying to pick up like gen eds and stuff. Is that we had a choice between psychology and philosophy, and I wouldn't. I think I ended up taking psychology and sociology. It was kind of a combination of the two.
I did those too,
and so I must admit, maybe just this has been a long time. Like a definite comparison of those, because they almost kind of seem one and the same until you start branching out.
Yeah, well, they're very similar. So the joke about philosophy is kind of like philosophy is like the mother of all disciplines. And the reason this joke is made is that it's just the oldest kind of thing, and things start out as philosophy, and then when they get kind of codified, they become other things, right? So, for example, Aristotle was studying creatures, and he had developed physics. But, no one would say Aristotle was the first physicist, or you could, but it would be weird, right? Or like Isaac Newton, a lot of people would have called Isaac Newton a natural philosopher. And so it's kind of a later development to differentiate these kinds of disciplines. So in terms of philosophy and psychology, I mean, psychology is a very new discipline, right? I mean, it started in terms of a formal separate thing. It started like at the end of the 19th century, really. So I think one way to break this down is psychology really studies sort of how people think, right? I mean, that's really what you're studying and focused on, is like, how do people think, and what are people's personalities like, and how do emotions contribute to things? And it's really, the sort of the stuff behind here, the mind that you're thinking about. That's great. I did a visual gesture on a podcast. Excellent. So
you said mind too, so we'll forgive you.
That's right. So philosophy is it's so weird to try to give a definition, but philosophy is basically a really kind of broad conceptual study of lots of things. And so traditionally you would break it down into 3 areas. You'd break it down into metaphysics, which is like, what kinds of things are real? Does God exist? Do we have free will? What are the nature of persons? What makes a person the same through time? If I think about like fundamental divisions of reality, like objects and properties, events and substances, that's all metaphysics stuff. Epistemology is like philosophy of knowledge. So how do I come to know things? How do my beliefs get justified? How do my perceptions justify my beliefs? What's just an opinion? When I get beliefs from other people, like through testimony, how reliable is it, et cetera? And then you have what it's called axiology, which is just a fancy word for value theory. So that's like things about both aesthetics, like beauty, natural aesthetic qualities of sunsets or mountains, but also like philosophy of art stuff. And then ethics is the other branch of axiology. So what is the right thing to do? What is the nature of goodness? How do I live a good life? Those are all sort of broad philosophical questions. I think probably a key thing about philosophy is that, unlike a lot of other disciplines, there's not really a good, quick way to get an answer to a question, right? Like, if I want to know where a star is, if I talk to an astronomer, and they're going to tell me, they're going to give me good empirical evidence, right? Evidence from the senses or through observation that can settle it. Or if I want to know when the tides come in, there's an easy way for me to get an answer to that, right? But like, do I have a soul? Do I have free will? What is the right thing to do? There's not usually a really quick, easy way to answer those things that is not controversial. So we got to argue about it. So the process of dialogue and argument, counter-argument, objection, response is really, I think, central to doing philosophy.
I feel like I should be taking notes. Is there a pop quiz after this?
So some of these words I haven't heard since being in school.
Some of them I've never heard at all. I need a cheat sheet or a dictionary or something. I did not prepare for this episode.
He actually has laminated handouts he's going to give us afterwards.
That's right. Yeah, I'll be sending you handouts. And
okay.
So no.
Well, Rob, I have a question for you too, and it's kind of a two-parter. Upon a suggestion from a friend who thought I'd be interested in a book, the book was Phenomenology by Chad England. And the first question is, do you ever, when you're reading, are you able to be objective enough, or do you argue with the author or the philosopher that's reading as you're reading their book? And then two, I read, I didn't think that there was a strong enough, and I don't like relativism, but it seems that the entire book was to try to convince me that phenomenology isn't relativism, and it seemed like all the proofs were really weak.
Yeah. Wow. What a good set of questions, Alan. Thank you. So the first question is,
Yay!
You're smart, Alan.
I did it.
You faked it. You impressed him.
It took almost 2 years, but
So I think, one thing we try to do that I try to encourage my students to do and that I try to do is, in philosophy, we try to do something called the principle of charity, which is you want to read as charitably as possible. The principle of charity.
Oh, well,
see, there we go. Connections.
Okay, I don't have to take notes on that one.
That's right. You got that one. So the principle of charity is basically whenever you're reading something, and really you can broaden it out to not just reading, but talking with other people, looking at what like an editorial says or what a person on TV says, is you just want to interpret things as charitably as possible, right? So what I mean by that is you want to make sure that you're not like, making the argument weaker or caricaturing it, right? I mean, you want to basically take it as strong as it possibly could be. So that way, when you think about and try to criticize it later, you're taking it at its sort of strongest terms. So, a quick example of this might be, here are two uncharitable ways of thinking about different people on different sides of like gun lobbying, right? So I could say, people that are gun rights advocates are just, they think everybody should have a gun, and there should be no restrictions on who can have a gun. Like you should be able to go to a gun store drunk, buy a flamethrower or a tank. That's a kind of a caricature of the position, right? Probably no person that's a Second Amendment rights activist believes that. On the other hand, if you want to think about gun control, an uncharitable way of interpreting it would be they want to take all of our guns away. They don't want anyone to have any kind of weapon for no reason. Most people that are thinking about gun control aren't thinking about that. They don't want to take like hunting rifles away from hunters or things, right? So, I mean, when we think about charity, it's just like, we want to make the argument as strong as possible because we want to take it at its, I mean, it's kind of like a golden rule thing. If I'm giving you my view, I want you to take it seriously. I don't want you to just like put words into my mouth that make it a dumb thing to believe or whatever, right? So if I'm trying to learn about something, I should try to approach it the same way. But I, like everybody, sometimes do fall prey, like you say, Alan, to, just reading something and being like, oh, well, that's stupid. Who would believe that? That's a terrible argument, right? And it's hard to do that sometimes. You got to kind of try to pull back. And as far as the other thing, the second question was about phenomenology and relativism.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct.
So I don't know a whole lot about phenomenology. That's an area that I haven't studied a lot of. When people talk about it, sometimes what they mean is like your subjective experience of things.
That's correct.
So when you think of phenomenology, one thing that you might think of is the subjective experience, like biting into an apple and the taste of an apple, right? The qualities of it. So that kind of subjective experience, that's sometimes what people mean when they talk about phenomenology. So, is the bite of the apple sweet? You might be upset like, oh, this red and delicious apple is red, but it isn't delicious. Or this apple tastes nothing like Granny Smith, right? Or something like that. Those are jokes. You can laugh at those. So in terms of phenomenology and subjectivity, that's really what you're thinking about. I think, I don't know about what to say about it in relativism. That's very different. Relativism usually is something like, that certain claims of truth are relative, and experiences are maybe relative to individuals, but like my experience of pain is probably different than yours, or my experience of joy might be different than yours. But often when people talk about relativism, they mean it more for broader claims, like it's relative whether, say, there are moral truths, or it's relative whether, what is the right thing to do. Moral relativism is, I think, the thing people are most concerned about. And that's, I think, kind of a different, like it strikes me as not entirely related to phenomenology. But I guess I don't know. I don't know the author you're talking about, so I'm not really sure what he was arguing.
Well, I think that you definitely demonstrated charitable, objective discernment.
Reading of the
discernment.
Insert big
Excellent.
word. Insert another big word.
Besides, we like apples, so I guess that'll work as a good object lesson.
Me too. A Fuji, a pink lady. Oh man,
Macintosh,
Honeycrisp.
Actually, Honeycrisp and Fuji are good. They're just more expensive.
What was the one that we made up? Because
the Yagasabi apple. Can you make something philosophical out of the apple we just invented last year?
Hey Rob, have you ever had the Yagasabi apple? Because it's delicious.
I don't think so. Yeah,
it's an apple inside of a grape, inside of a pear, inside of another apple, or something like that.
Yeah.
It's phenomenologically delicious.
Don't hurt yourself.
Yeah, phenomenologically delicious. Excellent. So I actually have two things I would like to say about apples.
Okay.
First of all, have you ever had a grapple?
Yes.
I've always wanted to. Never
Those are
have.
delicious, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
what's a grapple?
good.
Yeah, is that real?
I think it's a grape and an apple, right?
No, it's technically an apple that has like grape qualities.
Small?
Yeah, it's been soaked. No. Yeah, Sarah, your reaction is excellent.
Like, does a cherry tomato taste like a cherry?
So a grapple is like an apple that has been, I don't know, soaked or injected with some kind of grape flavor or grape juice, and so it has all of the. It is a little weird. It's a little weird. But it has the taste of like a grape, but like still it's an apple. So it has all the consistency and the bite and stuff like that of an apple.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I actually, I remember listening to the episode where you guys talked about the apples. And the weirdest thing about apples is their method of reproduction. Do you know about this?
Oh boy!
Oh, this
I don't mean like apples are freaks.
Yeah.
I mean like what happens with apples is like.
Is this appropriate content for children?
Should I be taking my children through the produce aisles? Dylan's.
Don't want kids.
This is, I think, fascinating. So apples are the kind of thing that do not produce true to seed. Right. So if you take like a Granny Smith apple and you take the seeds and plant them, you're not going to get a tree that produces Granny Smith apples. What happens is the seeds like do some kind of genetic recombination and produce a different thing. So what that means is that every Granny Smith apple you've ever had is from technically the same tree. They just take graftings of it and put it on another tree.
Interesting.
Really? Doesn't that blow your mind? That blew my mind when I found that out.
Yeah,
I don't even know. That's weird.
I don't understand, but that's okay. I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Well, it would be like the Pink Lady apple, right? That has the or the Honeycrisp. Honeycrisp is like one of my favorite apples.
Of course,
so it's very sweet, right?
Absolutely,
slightly tart, good crunch,
delicious,
a good size, and a nice look to it. Right? It's not totally red.
I want one right now. Very good.
Yeah, thank you. So if you took this, the weird thing about apple reproduction is if you took those seeds from a Honeycrisp and put it in your backyard, the tree that grew and the fruit it would sprout would not be Honeycrisp apples. They might not have the same taste.
What am I going to do with all these trees?
It would just be something different.
Is there like a one true apple out there that everything is like a branch of?
From the Garden of Eden,
the apple hub.
Are we looking? Is this your way of getting back to absolute goods and how we're all just shadows of the good?
So I think the thing that's interesting about this is that, this also makes you think about the Johnny Appleseed legend differently, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of apples that you would get, if he was selling, just sort of seeds that people could have, it's not like they were necessarily producing apples that would be good to eat. What they would do is you could make cider out of them, and cider often was easier to drink and less contamination than water at that time.
Johnny Apple cider seed.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think that's fascinating.
It is really cool.
And I was like, oh man, I wish I was on their podcast so I could talk to them about apple reproduction. But
and now look where you're at. You're
right?
here
on the
Keep your aspirations high, kids.
Yeah.
Right.
Someday you can be on our podcast talking about fruit reproduction.
Yes. Just give us as much charity as you can while listening.
We already have enough charity on this podcast.
It's enough for anybody.
Yeah. Well, now I'm just going to be thinking really, really deeply about apples for I think the rest of the day, and maybe I have to go grab one. So, we're going to go. Rob, thank you so much for being on and for talking to us about philosophy. I think that I definitely learned some new things about just just all the things you were talking about. Like we were saying before, never even knew there were so many branches out there for it. So, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you guys for having me. And I just want to say the most important thing about philosophy or anything that is just like a love of learning. So just keep reading and learning and encouraging that. And if you do that, and if you think hard and carefully in your day-to-day life, whether you're reading books or using, $50 words or anything, you're doing philosophy. So keep doing it.
Yeah.
So thank you all again for your time.
Well, thank you, Rob. Maybe next time you can talk about oranges with us.
Yeah.
And compare them to apples.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rob.
That's right.
So, thanks everybody for listening. And if you want to hear more of our episodes, I'm going to go ahead and let Sarah tell you where you can find them.
Thanks, Dan. So if you want to check out all of our newer episodes, we're available on all the different podcast platforms. We archive all of our shows too, and that's on doublestuffpod.com. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Double Stuff Podcast, and on Twitter at DoubleStuffP, and that's the letter P.